There once was a little corner of medieval Europe where ancient woodland gods still reigned, while all surrounding nations had long embraced the cross. In the late 14th century, as Gothic cathedrals rose across Europe and Latin prayers echoed from Ireland to Russia, the people of Lithuania still kindled sacred fires in oak groves and honored ancient pagan deities. Lithuania was the last pagan kingdom in Europe, a remarkable holdout against the sweeping tide of Christianity. This is a story of how that last pagan realm finally converted, a tale of war, diplomacy, kings and missionaries, and a very complex, centuries-long struggle between old gods and the new. The very term Lithuania appears in recorded history at a very telling time. In the year 1009, the annals of Gutenburg note that a Christian missionary, St. Bruno of Kierfur, was beheaded by pagans on the border of Lithuania. From its earliest mention, it was known as a pagan land, fiercely resisting Christian incursion. Over the next 4 centuries, while Europe's other tribes and kingdoms gradually came into the fold, the Franks by the 6th century, the Poles by 966, Kievan Rus by 988, the Scandinavians by the 11th and 12th centuries, the Lithuanians held fast to their ancestral religion. By the 14th century, they stood virtually alone, an island of paganism in a Christian sea. But why did Lithuania remain pagan for so long? And what finally brought about the change? The answer lies in a pretty unique mix of political pressures and internal pragmatism. For generations, Lithuanian Grand Dukes deftly balanced between the Christian East and West, using the very fact of their paganism as a political tool. Meanwhile, crusading knights from Western Europe mounted relentless campaigns to Christianize or conquer the Baltic holdouts by force. The eventual conversion of Lithuania in 1387 and the related baptism of its last pagan region, Samogitia, by 1413, ended the last chapter of Europe's pagan era. A conversion that was not a simple spiritual awakening, but a calculated state decision that reshaped Eastern Europe. A story today that we tell from start to finish, from the earliest encounters to the final days, when those last heads were dipped under the water. But let me welcome you to the channel first. I've been looking forward to doing this video for a while, I will admit. I do have some videos that I look forward to doing more than others. After all, we all have our own personal interests, right? If you've not subscribed yet, I would like to politely invite you to do so. Of course, only if you feel inclined to. Perhaps you'd like to leave your thoughts in the comments too. I always appreciate a spirited discussion. Now, what I'm sure you appreciate is the lack of ads not only on this video, but on every single video I make. In a time where ads are absolutely everywhere, it's quite a point of personal pride that we keep this channel 100% ad-free. We can only do so due to the generous contributions of those on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who checked out the merch store, it's got lots of goodies on there, and the occasional donation. It all helps. Links to all of that are available in the pinned comment and the video description. Now, with all that out of the way, introduction said and done, we may begin. Long before any formal state religion, the Lithuanians had a rich pagan belief system rooted in nature and ancestral tradition. As a Baltic people, they worshipped a pantheon of gods and spirits. The supreme deity was Dievas, the sky god, and especially important was Perkunas, the thunder god, that bringer of storms, much like Thor or Zeus in other mythologies. There were earth goddesses tied to fertility, and a host of lesser deities inhabiting forests, rivers, homes, things like that. In Lithuanian lands, sacred groves of oak trees served as open-air temples, and fire was a holy element. Chronicles describe that the pagan priests, Vaidelotes, kept a perpetual sacred fire burning in the honor of their gods. An enduring image is that of communities gathering in forest clearings round an oak altar and an eternal flame, offering animal sacrifices and prayers to ensure the fertility of their fields, and in less fortunate times, success in war. Some of these practices survived long enough to be observed, albeit disapprovingly, by outsiders. It was also said that grass snakes were kept and fed with milk as household guardian spirits, so revered that the Grand Duke Jogaila later had to order these holy serpents killed when he introduced Christianity. Holy groves were strictly protected in pagan Lithuania. Cutting an oak in a sacred grove was a grave sin before the old gods. Which brings us to the Teutonic Knights. A little parable about them. A German crusading order. They later reported finding and destroying wooden idols and altars in the Lithuanian forests, which is a terrible shame. Do you imagine if they had just taken them so we could put them into a museum? I suppose it doesn't always work like that. Either way, these accounts are a little bit biased. We have to remember that, but they do give us a glimpse of a deeply rooted spiritual culture tied to the rhythm of nature. Christianity had made a few tentative inroads to this world before the 13th century, but often with fatal results for the missionaries. It was a very dangerous undertaking. Let's look at the case of St. Bruno in 1009. That was one early encounter that we know quite well. Bruno was a zealous missionary and bishop, and he attempted to convert the border peoples near Lithuania. Big mistake. According to the Gutenburg Chronicle, he baptized a pagan leader of a neighboring Baltic tribe. But when he pressed on toward Lithuania proper, he and his entourage were killed, reportedly on the orders of a local pagan prince. Well, this violent welcome both showed Lithuania's determination to resist foreign religion and, ironically, immortalized Lithuania's name in the European records. A popular saying notes that Columbus discovered America and St. Bruno discovered Lithuania, meaning that Bruno's ill-fated mission was how Europe discovered the existence of this pagan land beyond Poland. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, Lithuania was still an emerging collection of tribes rather than a centralized kingdom. During this time, indirect Christian influences did manage to shuffle their way in. To the east and south, the Kievan Rus and other Slavic principalities had adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Through trade and intermarriage, Orthodox Ruthenian, that is, East Slavic culture, began to touch Lithuania. Some Lithuanian nobles took Orthodox Christian wives or entered alliances with Rus princes. In fact, archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that many Lithuanian nobles adopted Slavic Christian names for use alongside their own pagan ones. Either way, by the 12th century, Orthodox missionaries had reached some of the Baltic lands. For example, nearby Latgale, that is eastern Latvia, but they did have limited success among the Lithuanians themselves. But still, the influence was enough that many Old Church Slavonic loanwords for religious concepts, likely the word for church, Basnikia for baptism, Krikstas, that is, entered Lithuanian language at this time, showing that Lithuanians were aware of Christianity. Even if they were not converting en masse, they certainly knew what it was. Now, from the west came Latin Christian influence, and that's a bit different to the Orthodox tradition. And, of course, this time it came at the pointy end of a sword. The Northern Crusades. They began in the early 13th century, as the Catholic Church sanctioned crusading knights to subdue and convert the last pagan peoples around the Baltic. The Livonian Order, a branch of the Knights of the Sword, established itself in what is now Latvia and Estonia, while the Teutonic Order launched a crusade against the Prussian tribes, Western Baltic cousins of the Lithuanians, by the way. These military monastic orders founded fortress cities like Riga and Königsberg. That's right, they go all the way back. And they justified their conquest as a holy war against the barbaric pagans. By the mid-1200s, the pagan Prussians were largely conquered and forcibly converted, and the crusading orders set their gaze upon Lithuania next. Faced with aggressive Christian neighbors on multiple fronts, the Lithuanians were under growing pressure in the 13th century. This was the crucible in which the Lithuanian state coalesced, and religion, that was the central question. Would Lithuania go the way of its neighbors and accept baptism, whether by choice or force, or could it maintain its old ways and independence? Well, the first major answer to that question came with the reign of a certain ambitious duke, who briefly took Lithuania into the Christian fold, only for the country to slide right back into the old ways. That leader was King Mindaugas, and his story shows how fraught the issue of conversion really was. So let's talk about Mindaugas. By the 1240s, he had risen as the most popular Lithuanian duke, effectively a first ruler of a united Lithuanian state. Mindaugas was a shrewd and ruthless leader who expanded his influence not only over ethnic Lithuanian lands, but parts of neighboring Baltic tribes. However, his rise was challenged by rivals and the encroaching military orders. Surrounded by Christian powers, the Livonian Order to the north, the Teutonic Knights in the west, and Catholic Poland and Orthodox Rus in the south, Mindaugas recognized that Lithuania's survival might require a diplomatic as well as a military strategy. According to the chronicles of the time, around 1250 Mindaugas made a pretty bold political gamble. You see, he agreed to accept Christian baptism in exchange for peace and recognition. The Livonian Order, then fighting some of Mindaugas's internal rivals, offered him up a deal. Mindaugas would be baptized as a Roman Catholic, and in return the order and its allies in the church would acknowledge him as the king of Lithuania and cease their crusade against him. And so in 1251, Mindaugas was baptized, reportedly along with his wife and close family. In the following year, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull proclaiming Mindaugas as rightful king, a significant moment because up to that point all the Lithuanian leaders were pagan Grand Dukes, and none of them had any international recognition of kingship, that's for sure. On July the 6th, 1253, Mindaugas was crowned the King of Lithuania, with a crown sent from the Pope, signifying that Lithuania had, at least at the top, joined the family of Christian kingdoms. For a time, this seemed like the breakthrough that might Christianize the entire nation. Mindaugas allowed Catholic clergy into his domains. The first church was built in the capital region, and Latin prayers were translated for use in Lithuania. By aligning with the Catholic Church, Mindaugas gained a powerful ally. He could call himself a king, quote, by the grace of God, and the Teutonic and Livonian knights were, in theory, obligated to stop attacking a baptized ruler. Indeed, a short-lived peace did take hold. One of Mindaugas's own letters, whose text survives in later documents, proudly recalls that, quote, our predecessor, King Mindaugas, with his whole kingdom, was converted to the faith of Christ. However, the reality is a little bit more limited. It is likely that only a small circle around the king actually converted at this time, while the vast majority of the Lithuanian people and lesser nobles continued their pagan practices, just as before. Mindaugas' conversion was thus a top-down, politically driven affair, and it faced an uphill battle. Many Lithuanian nobles resented the new alliance with the very crusaders who had been their enemies. And what's more, is that Mindaugas' own power was very far from secure. In the year 1260, a rebellion, a major one at that, flared among the Samogitians, that is the northwestern Lithuanians, who inflicted a crushing defeat on the Teutonic knights at the Battle of Durbe. This victory emboldened anti-Christian sentiment. Mindaugas' nephew, Treniota, a staunch pagan at that, emerged as a leader of the Samogitians and convinced Mindaugas to abandon his new faith, joining the uprising against the Crusaders. Mindaugas, seeing the shifting winds, broke his peace with the Livonian Order in 1261, and it is possible that he did renounce Christianity too, as the later chronicles claim. If that is so, then it would mean that after about a decade of being a Christian king, Mindaugas reverted to the pagan camp. An extraordinary reversal, but one in keeping with Lithuania's pragmatic approach to religion. I'm sure you can imagine that the fallout was pretty swift. In 1263, Mindaugas was assassinated by Treniota and other rivals, and with his death, the fragile, short-lived Christian kingdom of Lithuania fell to pieces. The nascent Catholic Church structure set up under Mindaugas vanished, and his successors returned openly to the old religion. For the next 120 years, Lithuania would have no baptized ruler, and no official church. Mindaugas' experiment showed both the promise and peril of conversion. It brought international legitimacy, but at the cost of internal dissent and dependency on Crusader goodwill. This was a lesson that was not lost on the later Grand Dukes, by the way. After Mindaugas, Lithuania's leaders became very cautious about conversion. They understood that declaring themselves Christian could be a double-edged sword. It might stop the Crusades, but it could also undermine their authority at home, or even invite domination by powerful Christian neighbors. Thus Lithuania entered the 14th century firmly and proudly pagan, yet fully aware of the Christian world around it, and always that option of conversion that perpetually sat on the table. In the 14th century, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania rose to its apex of power, all while remaining officially pagan. Now, that was a unique situation. A large and expanding European state ruled by pagan Grand Dukes that controlled vast Christian populations. By 1350, Lithuania had absorbed much of the former Kievan Rus territories in today's Belarus and Ukraine. The irony was striking. This pagan Lithuanian empire now governed millions of Orthodox Christians in its eastern lands, even as it battled Catholic crusaders on its western frontiers. Religion in Lithuania became not only a matter of personal faith, but a diplomatic chess piece in a high-stakes game for survival. And the leaders skillfully vacillated between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic Christian influences, without really committing to either one of them. You see, they realized that by retaining their pagan status, it gave them a form of leverage. Well, for the Grand Dukes, particularly for the Grand Dukes Gediminas, ruling 1316 to 41, and Algirdas, 1345 to 77, retention of this paganism gave them a kind of useful diplomatic tool. You see, they could promise to convert as a bargaining chip, while preserving their independence. This period saw multiple false starts and negotiations of a Lithuanian conversion, none of which fully materialized, of course. Consider Grand Duke Gediminas, one of Lithuania's most famous rulers. Gediminas was a pragmatic and tolerant leader who corresponded widely with Christian Europe. In 1322 to 1324, he penned a series of remarkable letters to the Pope and to cities of the Hanseatic League in Germany. In these letters, which luckily we have them surviving to this day, Gediminas portrayed himself not as a barbarous infidel, but as an enlightened ruler, rather interested in Christianity under the right conditions. He complained bitterly to Pope John XXII that the Teutonic Knights, far from spreading true faith, were rather brutal invaders who, quote, devastated the land with sword and fire. Gediminas even claimed that a previous Lithuanian duke, perhaps an allusion to his predecessor, had invited Franciscans to build a church in Vilnius, but the knights had actually burned it down, using this story to argue that the knights were obstructing, not aiding, the conversion of Lithuania. In a masterful touch, Gediminas' letters vaguely promised that he was ready to accept baptism and place himself under the Pope's protection only, and only if the aggression ceased. Pretty clever, right? You see how this bargaining chip is certainly one they want to hold on to for a while. Not quite a get-out-of-jail-free card, but certainly better than nothing, that's for sure. Now, at the same time, Gediminas invited merchants, craftsmen, and clergy of all faiths to come and live in Lithuania. In a 1323 letter to the cities of Lübeck, Bremen, Magdeburg, and others, he famously announced that we worship God, and would allow Franciscans and Dominicans to preach freely. He listed that Lithuania already had Catholic churches operating in his realm, serving foreign merchants and the wives of German knights captured in battle, and he offered land and tax exemptions to any Europeans who would settle in his cities. Not a bad deal, right? But this was essentially a public relations campaign to show that Lithuania was not hostile to Christianity itself. No, they were only hostile to the violent crusaders, which they were trying to put across as not purveyors of real Christianity at all, but just brutal bullies. Gediminas' savvy correspondence won him a short-lived truce. The Pope sent legates to negotiate, and in 1324 the Teutonic Order was pressured temporarily to suspend its crusade. Many in Europe had believed that Lithuania was just about to convert, and indeed, Franciscan friars did arrive, all dressed up and ready to go in Vilnius to begin the instruction. But in the end, Gediminas never actually underwent baptism. When the Teutonic Knights resumed attacks a few years later, under dubious pretexts, any plans for conversion were shelved. It seems Gediminas had achieved what he wanted, a breathing spell of peace and some positive diplomacy, without giving up his pagan independence. He died, still an unbaptized worshipper of Perkunas, but having shown Europe that Lithuania could not be easily cowed. Now as for Gediminas' successors, they continued this rather delicate balancing act. His son, Algirdas, and Algirdas's brother, Kestutis, ruled jointly over different parts of Lithuania, and relentlessly fought off the Teutonic Knights throughout the mid-14th century. Both men kind of flirted around with the idea of conversion when it suited them. Algirdas, whose wives were Orthodox princesses, was rumored at times to consider converting to Orthodoxy, especially as a counterweight to the Latin Crusaders. One Russian chronicle even claims he was baptized Orthodox in his youth, though he later performed pagan rites openly, so, well, didn't really work that well, didn't it? Meanwhile, Algirdas's co-ruler, Kestutis, handled relations with the West. In 1349, Kestutis entered into talks with Pope Clement VI about a possible conversion to Catholicism. The idea of this was that Kestutis and his sons would be baptized, and even receive royal crowns, much like Mindaugas had, thereby nullifying the Crusader threat. The negotiation got pretty far, too. One chronicle notes that Kestutis agreed to be baptized if certain lands were recognized as his. But the plan was derailed when the King of Poland, a supposed mediator, suddenly grabbed some disputed territories for himself, making the Lithuanians suspect a trap. The deal fell apart. Kestutis remained pagan. A couple of years later, in 1351, Kestutis was captured during a clash with Hungarian forces allied to the Crusaders. The Hungarians tried the conversion gambit again. King Louis of Hungary offered to release Kestutis and grant him the crown if he would accept Christianity. Of course, he outwardly agreed to be baptized, and even swore an oath in the Christian camp. But guess what? I'm sure you can see what's going to happen. He insisted on swearing by his own pagan gods and not the Christian god. And, well, that's not really how it works. Well, the Christians weren't very happy about that. According to one account, he performed a pagan ritual of sacrifice, reportedly killing a bull with a thrown knife to seal the pact. Well, the gesture might have offered some reassurance to the Christians at the time, but it was likely a ruse. Kestutis knew an oath to pagan gods meant nothing to his captors. Sure enough, as soon as he was set free, Kestutis simply slipped away and returned home, well and truly unbaptized. And when he got there, he resumed the fight. It's a bit cheeky, don't you think? It's an example of how Lithuania's leaders were willing to play along, feign their conversion, just humoring the Christians for a while, only to maintain their freedom of action later on, sort of skulking away, giggling to themselves. Meanwhile, on the home front, Lithuania's ruling family was slowly absorbing aspects of both Christian cultures. Many princes of the Gediminid dynasty took Orthodox baptisms when it was politically convenient, often if they married into Slavic royalty or ruled over Orthodox lands. For example, Vaishelga, also known as Voselka, Mindaugas' son, he became an Orthodox monk and even founded a monastery. Jogaila, a son of Algirdas, was baptized Orthodox as a child too. But these individual conversions did not change the official state stance. They did mean, however, that the Lithuanian court was not ignorant of Christian customs. By the late 14th century, one could find Orthodox and Catholic Christians at the pagan Grand Duke's court, whether as in-laws, advisors, or perhaps even just foreign guests. Notably, there was no policy of persecuting Christians in Lithuania, unlike some earlier pagan societies, even Rome at one point. The Lithuanians generally tolerated Christian presence among foreigners or subject peoples, and this tolerance was another reason why the Grand Dukes did not feel an urgent need to convert. You see, they could allow faiths to coexist, while they themselves continued to honor the old gods. However, the common Lithuanian people, especially the peasants in the heartland and Samogitia, remained staunchly attached to their traditional religion through the 14th century. Pagan priests continued to conduct ceremonies, and the populace saw the Christian god as the god of the foreigners, not their own god. I mean, that doesn't mean that they were looking down on it. They were just saying that this is just not our thing. You can understand that, I suppose. There are recorded instances of extreme resistance when knights or missionaries were captured by Lithuanians in war. Sometimes they met a gruesome fate as human sacrifices to the pagan gods, but these are quite rare. The general picture was one of pretty broad tolerance, but we need to mention these ones. So the chroniclers of the Teutonic Order describe with horror how Lithuanian warriors would, on rare occasions, sacrifice a captured crusader in thanks for victory. There was actually a famous incident in 1320 after a battle at Mendininkai. The Samogitian Lithuanians took a high-ranking Teutonic knight, tied him to a wooden frame with his horse, and buried him alive as an offering to their gods of war. Decades later, even as late as 1389, just before the official conversion, a chronicler records that Samogitian pagans sacrificed a captured German commander by tying him to trees and stabbing him to death in a ritualistic execution. But we have to be said, these brutal acts were not everyday occurrences. They were exceptional, even in the 14th century. But they did make a strong impression on Christian Europe. And of course, it reinforced the image of Lithuanians as ferocious pagans. It is worth noting, too, that some Lithuanian leaders themselves began to see such practices as barbaric. The same Kęstutis who tricked the Hungarians was also said to have forbidden his followers from killing an important captive as a sacrifice in 1378, deeming it inappropriate to knights. It suggests that by the late 14th century that Lithuania had absorbed a bit of that Christian chivalric ethos, even if they weren't baptized. The society was certainly in a transitional state, politically and militarily pagan, but gradually learning the languages and norms of Christianity. By the 1380s, the stalemate was reaching a turning point. The Teutonic Knights, frustrated that Lithuania remained heathen, continued to wage yearly war, crusading raids, referred to as Racen in their chronicles. Samogitia, the northwestern region, was especially crucial. As long as Samogitia stayed in Lithuanian and pagan hands, it separated the Teutonic Knights in Prussia from their brethren in Livonia to the north. The order desperately wanted to conquer Samogitia and unite their territories, and Lithuania desperately wanted to hold on to it. Of course, this tug of war led to constant conflict. At the same time, another threat was looming: the growing power of Muscovy to the east. Recognize the name? Yes, it's Moscow, but we'll call them Muscovy today. Muscovy was an Orthodox Christian city, and had designs on uniting all Eastern Slavs under his rule. A pagan Lithuania controlling many Orthodox lands was an anathema to their ambitions. By 1380, Muscovy had defeated the Mongols at Kulikovo and was on the rise, offering itself as the protector of all Orthodox Christians, including those under Lithuanian rule, by the way. In this situation, the ruling Grand Duke, a young man named Jogaila, grandson of Gedimas, had to make the fateful choice. Jogaila inherited the throne amid civil strife and external peril. At first, he tried to play east against west. His mother was a Russian Orthodox princess, and one proposal in the early 1380s was for Jogaila to marry a daughter of the Grand Duke of Moscow and convert Lithuania to Orthodoxy, making Lithuania a sort of junior partner to Moscow. On the other side, the Polish nobility offered Jogaila a different deal. Marry the young Queen Jadwiga of Poland, convert to Catholicism, and become the King of Poland, thereby allying Catholic Poland with Lithuania against the Crusaders. Of course, each option had pretty big implications. Converting to Orthodoxy might have eased relations in the East, but done nothing to stop the Teutonic Knights, who wouldn't recognize an Orthodox conversion as ending their crusade, but it also risked making Lithuania subordinate to Muscovy. Converting to Catholicism and joining with Poland, on the other hand, would immediately pit Jogaila against the Knights in a united front and give him a royal title. But it meant a profound shift westward, and an abandoning any tolerance for orthodoxy at the state level, potentially upsetting his Orthodox subjects, and there were plenty of them. After careful deliberation, Jogaila chose the Polish option. It was arguably the greatest strategic decision in Lithuanian history, one that would create a new European powerhouse and alter the region's fate for centuries. In 1385, the Union of Krewo was agreed. Jogaila would accept baptism in the Latin Rite, marry a Queen Jadwiga, who was 12 years old at the time, by the way. Why don't you take a seat over there, Jogaila, and be crowned King of Poland? But in return, he pledged to Christianize his entire Lithuanian realm, and united with Poland in a personal union. Of course, to sweeten the deal for Lithuania's nobility, Jogaila, who would take the name Vladislav II Jogaila after baptism, also agreed to release Polish captives and pay compensation for war damage. But importantly, he did not cede political control of Lithuania. It was to remain a Grand Duchy, ruled by his family, only now fraternal with Poland and sharing the Catholic faith. The dawn of a new Lithuania. Jogaila moved quickly to fulfill his promises. In early 1386 he travelled to Krakow, the capital of Poland, and on February 15, 1386, he was baptized, emerging from the baptismal font as a Christian monarch named Ladislaus or Vladislav. Not sure about the pronunciation. It might be Ladislaus, actually. Correct me in the comments, I'm sure you will. Later that month, he married Queen Jadwiga and was crowned the King of Poland. These events were watched with amazement from across Europe. The conversion of the Lithuanian prince was hailed by the Pope and many leaders as the great victory for Christendom. But the hard part was still to come, converting the people of Lithuania themselves, many of whom had never even seen a priest, and had, fought Christians all their lives. It was going to be a hard sell. In 1387, now as a fully empowered king, Jogaila returned to his native land at the head of a sort of Christian mission. He brought with him priests, many of them from Polish and Czech lands, and a contingent of Polish knights for protection and influence. According to the Polish chronicler Jan Długoszy, who later described the event in detail, Jogaila began in his capital, Vilnius, which is still the capital of Lithuania, by the way, by summoning the Lithuanian nobles and explaining the benefits of the Christian faith. Many of the higher boyars, or nobles, seeing which way the wind was blowing and influenced by their leader's example, agreed to baptism. The operation had a both spiritual and pragmatic side. Jogaila granted privileges and land incentives to those nobles who converted, effectively tying their political loyalty to the new faith. In February of 1387, he issued edicts that formally freed many noble families from certain taxes and corvée labor, on the condition, of course, that they were baptized Catholics. It was a shrewd move. It made conversion not just a matter of piety, but also one of social advancement and economic benefit. But for the common folk, large-scale baptism ceremonies were organized. Contemporary accounts tell of how priests fanned out from Vilnius into the surrounding regions of Lithuania proper. Villagers were gathered, often by the hundreds, to the nearest river or lake to be baptized en masse. There is a famous, though apocryphal, perhaps, scene describing by later writers. Jogaila himself, it is said, went down with priests from village to village, destroying the old wooden idols, chopping down the sacred groves, and personally pouring holy water over the heads of peasants who knelt before him to receive baptism. And whether or not the Grand Duke literally baptized people with his own hands, he certainly took symbolic actions to demonstrate the end of the old era. Jogaila ordered the sacred fires extinguished and the holy oak groves cut down, and he commanded that all serpents and grisly snakes kept in houses as household gods to be killed, a dramatic public repudiation of pagan beliefs. Well, that certainly marks the sharp break with the past, if anything. The altars of Perkunas were torn down, and a Christian cross was put up in their place. Under Jogaila's guidance, the foundations of the church in Lithuania were quickly laid. A new bishopric of Vilnius was established in 1387 with the Pope's approval. The first bishop of Vilnius set up his cathedral in the very heart of the capital. Interestingly, the site chosen for the Vilnius Cathedral was said to be the location of an old pagan temple, possibly one dedicated to Perkunas. By building the cathedral there, the Lithuanians sent a clear message that the old religion is gone and the new one was here to stay. Churches were also founded in other key towns. It is claimed by Dlugosi, the historian we mentioned before, that the first batch of churches were built in places that had been important pagan centers or estates of the Grand Dukes. Towns like Krewo, Jogaila, Mendininkai. Many of these early churches were so modest wooden structures, but they signified a permanent change in the spiritual landscape. Also, it's important to note that the conversion process, while enforced from above, was not described as excessively bloody or coercive, at least not by the standards of the time. Unlike some earlier forced conversions in Europe, there were no reports of mass slaughter or martyrdom in Lithuania's baptism. This was partly because Jogaila and his cousin, Vytautas, who soon became the Grand Duke of Lithuania under Jogaila's overlordship, were careful to persuade and reward the population, and partly because decades of pressure had perhaps made many Lithuanians resign to eventual conversion. As for the pagan priests, they seem to have lost their influence quite quickly once the political leadership tossed them aside. We hear of no large-scale rebellions in 1387 against Christianization either. It certainly helped that people were not required to learn a new language for worship immediately. Many priests likely preached in the local language, or in Ruthenian, which was understood by some, and Christian concepts were slowly introduced. and when they were introduced they were on more familiar terms. Of course, conversion didn't magically transform everyone overnight. Many peasants went through the motions of baptism, accepting the sign of the cross and new Christian names, but quietly continued some pagan customs in their daily lives. Seems to be a Lithuanian tradition that we've learned in this video. Now, realizing this, Jogaila and Vytautas did not engage in any brutal inquisitions. Instead, they tolerated a gradual blending of cultures. No one was executed for secretly keeping a talisman or honoring the harvest in the old way. The approach was more carrot than stick, I suppose. The rulers genuinely wanted their people to accept Catholicism, but they understood that it would take time for the old beliefs to fade away. In the interim, having the official label of Christian was what really mattered, at least on an international stage. Certainly helped remove that excuse for crusades. And indeed, the international impact was immediate. The Pope in Rome was overjoyed to welcome Lithuania into Christendom. In 1388, Pope Urban VI issued a bull recognizing Lithuania as a Catholic country and confirming the establishment of a bishopric in Vilnius. That same year, the Pope explicitly ordered the Teutonic Knights to cease all of their attacks on Lithuania. After all, one couldn't crusade legitimately against baptized fellow Christians, right? The Knights, stubborn and unconvinced of Lithuania's sincerity, tried to continue their war for some years, but their moral authority to do so was greatly undermined. By formally converting Lithuania, effectively pulled the rug out from under the Crusaders' justification for war. However, there was one unresolved issue: the Samogitians. The Samogitians, inhabiting the northwest region of Lithuania, were the most fervently pagan group and had been on the front lines of battles with the Teutonic Order. At the time of Jogaila's 1387 mission, much of Samogitia was actually under the de facto control of the Teutonic Knights. Due to recent treaties, Jogaila had, in a controversial earlier pact, that is the 1384 Treaty of Duisa, temporarily yielded parts of Samogitia to the Order. I'm sure the Samogitians were not made aware of that until people showed up to claim their land. Thus, the 1387 baptisms did not reach the Samogitian villagers. For all practical purposes, the Samogitians remained pagan, even after Lithuania proper was baptized. The very last pocket of organized paganism in Europe. It would take another quarter of a century to get this final Samogitian question settled. The first step was the great victory of the Lithuanian Polish forces over the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. You may also hear this called the Battle of Tannenberg, by the way. This was a battle that broke the power of the Teutonic Order and was largely sparked over the disputes over the Samogitians. In the aftermath, the Peace of Thorn in 1411 restored Samogitia firmly to Lithuanian control, at least until the lifetime of Vytautas. With the Crusader threat effectively neutralized, Grand Duke Vytautas the Great, Jogaila's cousin, and now the ruler of Lithuania's day-to-day affairs, moved to finish what Jogaila had begun. In 1413, Vytautas personally undertook the mission to baptize the Samogitians. Chroniclers describe how the aging Grand Duke traveled by boat down the Niemen River into the heart of Samogitia, accompanied by priests and an armed escort. He convened gatherings of Samogitian elders, much as Jogaila had done elsewhere, perhaps recalling how fiercely independent this region had been. Vytautas is said to have employed a mix of firmness and even fatherly persuasion. Eventually, the Samogitians agreed to abandon their old practices and accept baptism. In group ceremonies along the Dubica River and at the settlement of Jogaila, the last pagan communities in Lithuania received Christianity. There's an image of those moments. Proud Samogitian warriors who once offered prisoners to their war gods, now kneeling to receive the sign of the cross from a bishop's hand. An epical change in spiritual allegiance. By 1417, the integration of Samogitia into the church was formalized by the creation of the Diocese of Samogitia, with its seat eventually at Medininkai, later known as Varniai. This marked the final, official Christianization of Lithuania's people. At long last, every last region of Lithuania was under the pastoral care of the Catholic Church. The Baltic Crusades, which had raged for 200 years, abruptly lost their reason. The last pagan nation in Europe had finally been converted. Yet, as we all know on the ground, old habits die hard. For decades, even centuries after 1413, observers noted that many Lithuanians, especially in the more remote villages, still practiced elements of their ancient faith under a veneer of Christian superficiality. In the 15th century, Catholic missionaries working in Samogitia complained that some newly baptized folk would secretly worship at the old sacred oak stumps, or continue to burn offerings of grain and animals during certain festivals. As late as the 16th century, church authorities in Lithuania wrote about peasants who kept serpents in honor and practiced pagan rites at home, prompting renewed campaigns to eradicate these, quote, superstitions. The famous Polish-Lithuanian cardinal Stanislaw Hozdu in the 16th century noted with frustration that in parts of Lithuania, quote, the people come to church, but still whisper prayers to trees and snakes. Over time, however, especially through the efforts of the Counter-Reformation and better education of the clergy, these vestiges faded. By the 1600s, the vast majority of Lithuanians were devout Roman Catholics, and the memory of the old gods survived only in folk songs and stories. The Catholic faith had become so entrenched that Lithuania would later be known as a bulwark of Catholicism in the East, somewhat ironically, I suppose. And so to sum all this up, the conversion of Lithuania was not just a religious event, it was a political turning point. By joining the Catholic fold, Lithuania effectively tied its fate to Western civilization rather than Eastern. The personal union of Jogaila and Jadwiga blossomed into a long-term Polish-Lithuanian alliance, culminating in the Union of Lublin in 1569, which created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that was one of the largest and most powerful states in 16th century Europe. A union like that would likely not have been possible without the common faith that bound the Polish and Lithuanian elites after 1387, and thus the baptism of Lithuania paved the way for a multicultural, multi-faith federative state that would endure for centuries, ultimately shielding Europe's east from Mongol and later Ottoman encroachment. But from a modern perspective, the story of Lithuania as Europe's last pagan kingdom certainly has its romantic allure. It represents the persistence of indigenous European religion, long past the time it faded elsewhere. Because Lithuania converted so late, historians and folklorists have been able to glean relatively detailed information about the Baltic pagan practices, from songs, early ethnographic accounts, and the writings of Christian chroniclers who witnessed those practices firsthand. This has allowed for partial reconstruction of the old mythology and rituals, something harder to do for, say, the paganism of the Gauls or Germanic tribes that vanished in late antiquity, without much of a trace to show for it, too. So in a way, Lithuania's delay of conversion preserved a fragment of the ancient pre-Christian heritage of Europe into the early modern period. And today, Lithuania remembers both its pagan past and Christian heritage, and with pride. The nation still celebrates Statehood Day on July 6th, commemorating the coronation of King Mindaugas in 1253, interestingly honoring the first baptismal king, even though his Christian kingdom was short-lived. Meanwhile, in 1987, the country marked its 600th anniversary of official Christianization with great fanfare, even under Soviet rule, by the way, which was a delicate balancing act of historical pride. There has even been a neo-pagan revival movement in recent decades, called Remover, after a legendary old Baltic temple that seeks to reconstruct and practice the ancient Baltic faith. Such groups remain small, but they're certainly growing. Excuse me. And they testify to an enduring fascination with the old gods of Lithuania. I think that's a fascination that is not going to go away for quite some time. Well, neither am I. I am not going away. Don't worry, I'm going to keep making more of these videos for you. We had fun, didn't we? Well, you didn't get any ads, which if you did get ads, well, that wouldn't be very fun, wouldn't it? And you didn't get the ads because of these lovely people that I'm about to read off. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfetnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa. Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, and Brittany. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in the next video. Lots of love to you all. Good night for now.